Hello, welcome to our research seminar series on religion and conflict. And we're delighted to have Harith Ramli here, who will be introduced by Yazid very soon. So just to let everyone know that we will all keep ourselves muted, and we are only recording the main talk, and question and answer session will be not within the recording. So I welcome you all on behalf of the Desmond Tutu Center for War and Peace Studies. My name is Salman Al-Azami. I'm the Deputy Director of the center. And this is the third of our, actually it should have been fourth, but our last speaker last week, David Cook, is still in the ice in Houston, Texas. So he was not able to give his presentation last week. So we are trying to reorganize it. So this is our third seminar on religion and conflict. So I'll now hand over the mic to Yazid Saeed, my colleague in the theology department, to introduce the speaker and chair the event. Thank you.
Thank you, Salman. And it's a delight to be able to introduce Harith, who is not only a good scholar, but also a good friend. And it's wonderful for me to be able to have him join us at Liverpool Hope. And we're sorry that this is not in person, but virtually. As you know, we have to do these things online these days. But Harith is, Dr. Harith Ramli is a lecturer in theology and world religions at the Faculty of Education at Edge Hill University. His primary area of research is the history of the Sufi tradition, with focus especially on the impact of Sufism on broader intellectual trends in Islamic history. He has also published on the development of Islamic schools of theology and law. His talk will be titled Hindu Moksha versus Muslim Shahada in Early Modern Malay, Epic Literature. And I will leave him to tell us more about that topic. So Harith, over to you, and we're looking forward to what you have to share with us today.
Thank you very much, Yazid, and also Salman for inviting me to the seminar. I better start with a kind of caveat, an apology really, because this is essentially my breakout paper for this area. I normally work on 10th century Islamic thought, specifically Sufi texts and Islamic theology, although I've gone into Ottoman Sufism recently as well. But this has always been a kind of lifelong love of mine, going all the way back from my childhood, essentially. The idea of epics, the spiritual meaning behind epics. I was raised, my mother raised me to read the Quran and the Old English epic known as Beowulf at the same time. So that's been kind of back there in sort of my upbringing, but also I've always had a long desire to go back to the Malay tradition, particularly the Sufi teachings of the Malay tradition. So this is always kind of there in the background. And I always felt, well, firstly, to understand these Sufi Malay texts, one has to first ground oneself in the Arabic tradition, in the Persian tradition. So this is a long journey that I'm essentially using your seminar to kind of start this long journey. So I hope, my apologies if this is a fairly kind of amateurish introduction to the topic. I suppose the main thing, the original kind of story behind why I'm looking at epics rather than the kind of theological text that I'm more used to working on, is simply the lack of materials. When we look at the Malay tradition going all the way back to the 16th century, there seems to be quite a clear divide between two types of writing, essentially. And together with that, we could probably assume that there are oral traditions involved here. The first are the type of Sufi writings that are quite similar to the ones that you will find in the Islamic world, particularly in the Arabic world. Introductions to tasawwuf, treatises on spiritual practices, dhikrs, and so on. And these are quite fairly similar to what you would expect. And many of these people who write these texts studied themselves in either India or the Middle East. And the second type of texts are, I suppose, what you could designate as secular texts, texts inhabiting a more kind of less obviously Islamic area. So originally, I wanted to look at Sufi texts, more kind of explicitly Sufi texts, and look at whether or not they engage with the pre-Islamic Hindu, Buddhist, and animist traditions that were around and still were around even back in the day when I was growing up. I still remember people making sacrifices to rice field spirits and so on. So the disappointing thing is that it's hard to find any evidence of engagement with the more explicit Sufi and theological teachings with those type of practices, other than the occasional rebuke of certain popular practices, such as taking ritual baths at certain times of the week and so on. So this in a way pushed me to look into the hikayat, which is another genre, a whole genre of text, which actually the word hikayat as well, I probably should mention, it's used in a much looser way than it would be within the Arabic tradition. The word hikayat can be used for stories, as you would find within a popular kind of storytelling genres of the Arabic world, Arabic-speaking world, such as hikayat antar and so on. But it is also used to mean any type of narration in general. So that would even include historical or perhaps semi-historical texts. One of the old words for the oldest known historical text we know of from the Malay tradition, Sejarah Melayu, is sometimes also referred to in the early sources as Hikayat Melayu. It's also used for autobiographical texts. So the famous 19th century autobiography and kind of Rihla treatise by Munshi Abdullah was also referred to as Hikayat. So the word Hikayat actually has a very large, loose kind of usage. And how I'm using it today would be the way it's used more often by scholars such as Vladimir Roginsky, which is more specific to the kind of romance/epic literature, sometimes mixing elements of legend with history, sometimes purely legendary. As we'll see, the word hikayat actually, when we look at the actual evidence from anthropology, we'll see that there is actually even a wider use of hikayat, which is a kind of as a ritual performance, evoking a kind of either magical quality or sometimes also blessings from the kind of Islamic sense of the word. So I probably should specify that what I'll be looking at today is the hikayah in the kind of epic sense of the word. But I'll be looking for its kind of connection to the wider performative aspect of the epic. And the reason being, again, that one can't seem to find really much evidence of engagement between Islamic and Hindu thought. So hence the title. Alongside that, I'll be specifically looking at conflict and the idea of war magic within these texts as well, because I think this is something that has been fairly neglected by scholars of classical Malay literature. So we take the famous classical division by Broginski of the three types of Malay literature, classical Malay literature. He divides them into, firstly, using Malay terms here, indah, which are basically genres of literature that are more focused on beauty. This corresponds to the idea of adab within the Islamic context. The second type is moral ethical. So he uses the term buddhi, which is again actually a Hindu-Buddhist word originally, but connected more to the Islamic idea of aql. So these types of texts would be more kind of aimed at moral edification, ethics, and so on. And the third category is hati, which is equivalent to the Sufi idea of qalb or heart. And this would be texts that are more explicitly aimed at spiritual development. So the ultimate kind of purification of the soul, which is the long-term goal of Sufi texts. So what I find here is that while these three categories are of course a great framework to start our discussion on, it feels like there are certain gaps here that don't quite address the way these texts are appreciated and used in a populist context, even up to this day. And so I will add a fourth dimension to this, which is Sakti. Again, another term which actually ultimately derives from Indian origin, related to kind of the idea of power, spiritual power, or magic even. And I guess the case I want to make here is that beyond these three categories, we should also think of these texts as texts that carry a certain type of magical quality about them, and in fact are utilized with the aim of a kind of magical or spiritual practice. In fact, actually, Berginski himself, if we look at his more recent work of the last decade or so, we can see that he's actually ventured into this territory himself. Some of his, probably his greatest sort of recent work have been on the poem known as Sha'ir Bahrun Nisa, the Ocean of Women, which I think Berginski quite convincingly makes the case is actually, while thoroughly Islamicized, draws on a kind of pre-Islamic tantric tradition, which might or might not actually reflect practices related to sexual yoga. So alongside this, I suppose I should mention a few other people who are carving new territory in the area of magical studies in Islam, such as Melvin Kushki, Liana Saif, and others, who are basically overturning, particularly in the context of the late medieval Islamic or early modern Islamic period, and showing how actually magic maintains a quite significant presence, not only at the popular level, but also within the context of Mughal or Safavid or Ottoman palaces too. So to start with, I suppose one could also add the Hikayat are an interesting place to start because they sort of form a liminal space in the way that they approach both Islamic and Hindu teachings. And I'll show a few examples of this in a bit. And again, I guess it's worth thinking about recent scholarship in this context. Sheldon Pollock's idea of the Sanskrit cosmopolis, which is that kind of expanded the idea and made us understand a lot more the relationship between vernacular religious cultures and the universalizing tendency towards Vedanta and certain practices of yoga that have become kind of a more, what we would identify as mainstream features of Hinduism today. And alongside that, Ronit Ricci's work on the Arabic cosmopolis, which is in some ways doing the same kind of thing for the kind of wider cultural sphere of the Muslim world across the Indian Ocean. So in some ways, these texts perform this kind of liminal space where the kind of boundaries, I would argue, between the two cosmopolises, Pollock's Sanskrit and Ricci's Arabic, kind of negotiate with each other. And the question is, I guess, to what extent there's a clash going on here, or is there actually a kind of synthesis going on in a more harmonious fashion? Okay, so just to give us a kind of indication of why we're, why we can't really start with more explicit kind of Sufi teachings. If we look at the Javanese literature in contrast to the Malay literature, we'll see that there are much more direct engagements here. So for example, a recent study of the 19th century Suluk texts of Java show that, up till the 19th century, and actually, in fact, he argues that Edwin Wiranga here argues, in fact, there was a revival of this in the 19th century context, that there actually is a very explicit attempt to identify certain core spiritual values within epics such as the Ramayana and the Mahabharata. So for example, we look at this text here, the case is made quite clearly that the appreciation of the epic known as the Mahabharata, specifically the the actual battle scene between the two warring families, the Pandavas and the Kauravas, actually has a high spiritual meaning. So it says, as for the war in the way of God, it is not about fighting the godless and the unbeliever in one's breasts. There is the Bharata Yuddha war, most intense, in which a fierce hand-to-hand fight takes place within oneself. In fact, that is the war in the way of God. And in fact, it's interesting here that he uses the word Perang Sabil, which is a very loaded term already in this context. The Dutch were already fighting against Perang Sabil. So the word Perang is war. Sabil, of course, those of you who know Arabic will notice it comes from, of course, the word jihad fi sabilillah. So here's a very clear identification between a Hindu story and an Islamic idea. And this doesn't really contradict, in fact, Hindu readings of the narrative as well, of course, as well known. For those of you who are familiar with the Bhagavad Gita, kind of the climax of the whole story where Arjuna is basically told by Krishna that the true meaning of yoga, of moksha, of spiritual attainment really is to kind of deepen oneself in accepting one's kind of position, in his case, a warrior, and face death without fear of consequences, and perform the action without any attention to its consequences, and thereby attaining kind of the highest state of union with the divine. So this is actually alive and well in Java, and I think if you spoke to a Javanese about this on the street, they wouldn't be surprised by this interpretation. And as we're well known, the wayang kulit shadow puppet theater is something performed on a daily basis in cities like Yogyakarta. So the thing is, why is it that in the Malay literature we don't find such a direct connection being made? And in fact, as anyone who knows the Malaysian context, for example, wayang kulit has been banned in many places, especially if it contains any very explicit Hindu or Buddhist elements. So to go a little bit further, we'll have to go and take a little tour for the hikayat to maybe perhaps see if there is a deeper meaning being brought out through the epics, since we can't find any direct engagement in the more explicitly Islamic texts written by the ulama. So one famous place to start with, and this again begins the conversation about how these texts were appreciated. This is from the Sejarah Melayu, which is one of the oldest kind of historical texts, dating perhaps around the 17th century, I suppose, by conservative estimates. So this story takes place on the eve of the Portuguese invasion of Malacca, and in the story, the king essentially calls on his kind of followers, and he says, well, why don't we're just sitting around waiting for the enemy to attack, why don't we read something? So let us read a tale of war that we may profit from it. And so then the suggestion is made. So there's two texts that are suggested to the king. The first is the hikayat of Muhammad Hanafiya, and the second is the hikayat of Amir Hamza. So the young noble said to Tun Arya, go, sir, and take this message to the ruler that all of us crave from the story of Muhammad Hanafiya, in the hope that we may obtain profit from it, for the Franks, i.e. the Portuguese, are attacking tomorrow. Tun Arya accordingly went into the palace and presented himself before Sultan Ahmad, to whom he addressed the young noble's request. And Sultan Ahmad gave him the story of Amir Hamza. So this is a story about the Prophet's uncle, Hamza. We would give you the story of Muhammad Hanafiya. Did we not fear that the bravery of the gentlemen of our court falls short of the bravery of Muhammad Hanafiya? But it may be that their bravery is such as was the bravery of Hamza, and that is why we give you the story of Hamza. So this is interesting, that the thing is that this text suggests that people recited hikayat before going into battle. And secondly, that different texts were considered to have different kind of properties. So, given the option of the hikayat Muhammad Hanafiya, which is a long story that includes the well-known tragedy at Karbala, and then it's followed by a kind of semi-legendary depiction of Muhammad ibn Hanafiya, another one of the sons of Ali, fighting against the forces of the Umayyads. So the suggestion here is that certain texts provide too much power, too much bravery, and people who don't have the right level, well, something wrong would happen to them. So I tried to find a parallel with this elsewhere in the Islamic tradition, and again, it's not entirely my area, military texts, but so far I've gone through quite a few, and I haven't found evidence of reading of hikayat before battle. However, I have found some evidence in Harawi's Tadhkira al-Harawiya fi Hiyal al-Harbiya, which is a text dating to the Ayyubid period. So this is smack right in the middle of the Crusades, where Harawi, an Afghan scholar who ended up in the court of the Ayyubids, writes, among other things, recommends that a king should make sure that in his court there is frequent recitation of accounts of battles and wars, going back to the ancient Persians, the ancient battles of the Arabs, including the stories from Islam. And in fact, later on in the text, he gives examples from the different times of the rightly guided caliphs, the tragic deaths of heroes, books of military strategy, and also descriptions of those who are exemplary in chivalry, military prowess, and bravery. So he summarized, he says, with these types of effects on the emotions of the audience, this will encourage them to charge into enemy lines, overcome cowardice and weakness, and also create a sense of honor in the hearts of those who are listening to them. So this is as close as I could find within the Islamic tradition so far. And again, I haven't done a thorough exploration of these texts, and more might be revealed by looking at Indian or Persian sources as well. However, I think there's something more going on here in the Muslim context. So Brakel himself, who is the editor of the Hikayat Muhammad ibn al-Hanafiya, actually suggests, and he goes against most of the kind of contemporary readers of this text who argue that these texts were read simply for kind of inspiration, or he argues that actually the word courage here used by the Sultan actually means something closer to Sakti, or kind of a spiritual power or energy. Brakel doesn't really go any further into this, so we'll have to kind of find evidence elsewhere of how these hikayats are read. Again, I think it's worth kind of maybe stopping for a few moments to reflect again on the problems of what these the texts we receive them today, to what extent they reflect the texts that were in existence at the time. So if the story were actually real, I mean, if this is based on an actual event, it's hard to establish necessarily whether the Hikayat Muhammad Hanafiya as we have it today is necessarily the same as it was before. I mean, Sweeney also makes the case that we often forget that many of these traditions were and still are live oral traditions. And so the textual transmissions of these traditions should not be taken as seriously as perhaps one might. And again, I guess it's worth reflecting again on Braginsky's tripartite division of genres, as I mentioned earlier, the division into texts which are aimed at creating aesthetic feeling, indah. Those are aimed at kind of moral edification, buddhi, and those which are aimed at spiritual edification. And actually, Braginsky makes his division more complex. In the beginning of the book, he kind of simply divides different genres under these three categories. But later on, he actually shows that even certain texts, you could actually read them, a single text, on these three levels. And the best example are the hikayats, which when he looks at them, he argues that they're working on three levels. They're working on the aesthetic appreciation, and they're working also on the level of moral edification. But actually, if you go further into them, they are actually quite closely written as signposts and allegories, as directives to the Sufi path. And I guess, yeah, I've mentioned there's another area that I haven't had time to look into, and I haven't found much evidence of work in this area, or the way in which hikayats are appreciated in the Indian and Persian tradition. So going again to Muhammad al-Hanafiya, actually, Muhammad al-Hanafiya itself, as demonstrated by Brakel, but more recently by Danishgar, is directly based on Persian influences. So it would be quite interesting to look at to what extent these are or have been performed in the Persian-Iranian context. So Muhammad Hanafiya is, I guess, going through it, I haven't found any evidence of Kasaktian in a very obvious way. There are certain things where you find that the liminality is demonstrated by, so one example is the Prophet Muhammad is told that his grandchildren are going to die, and then there's mention of a practice. Now, if you look at the wording very carefully, the wording sort of hints at a practice where food is eaten on the festival of Ashura, not as a commemorative act, but actually as an act of providing food for the dead spirit. So again, this is a very common Southeast Asian practice. So there are elements, even though this text is taken from Persian origins, there is a lot of evidence of kind of original creative reinterpretation in this text, which reflect the kind of sensibilities of its readers. Another way we can look at the way in which hikayat were performed or appreciated is maybe by looking at some examples from the hikayat themselves. So Hikayat Hang Tua, the well-known, perhaps I guess the hikayat, really the kind of exemplary hikayat, where which is a story of Hang Tua, the hero that time and time again saves the Sultanate of Malacca from its foes. In the story, one of Hang Tua's close associates and later rival, Hang Jabat, is actually described in a lot of detail as a talented hikayat reciter. And actually, what's interesting about this is that it's clear that the performance, based on the description of Hang Jebat's recital, the hikayat was often accompanied by music as well, pipe music. And Hang Jebat is said to have such an exquisite voice that he was able to actually enthrall his readers, his audience into different states, including falling asleep. So again, this is a well-known trope, actually, if you're familiar with the Sufi literature. In fact, going all the way back, there are certain legends about the philosopher Al-Farabi, who was said to have been so good at performing music that he was able to induce different states in the mind of his listeners. So the idea of music actually being part of the performance of hikayat makes one question, to what degree are we talking about prose? Because if we turn to two examples that are kind of still current today, one from Aceh on the island of Sumatra, and the other from the island of Lombok, which is closer to Bali. Both of these cultures use hikayat, Malay hikayat, in a musical sense. So they're performed with music, sometimes also with military paraphernalia such as swords or the keris. But also these are tend to be written in rhyme. So they tend to be poems actually rather than prose. I just want to take a little digression actually to discuss the idea of hikayat as war magic here. Now that I mentioned the Aceh context. So if we go back to the 19th century, there was a kind of resurgence of this literature of hikayat Perang Sabil, which are kind of hikayat which were dedicated to encouraging people to go and join the military struggle against the Dutch. And what's interesting is there's so many cases where these hikayat were not simply recited before battle as an act of encouragement, but were also believed to have given the listeners qualities such as invincibility. In fact, some reports from the colonial records show that on the bodies of some of the warriors who were killed, they were actually text papers from the hikayat that were kind of wrapped around their bodies, perhaps in the belief that they would protect them. More interestingly, I think there are certain elements, recurring tropes in the hikayat here, which seem Islamic at first hand, but when you probe more deeply, it's a bit harder to establish where the source is. So one is the mysterious case of a huri or paradise called Ainul Mardiya, who's mentioned quite a lot in hikayat. In fact, there is a hikayah which is called Hikayat Ainul Mardiya. And in the story of Ainul Mardiya, essentially, according to contemporary sources, this is sort of derived from the hadith, but I've yet to find a clear example from the hadith here. A young man called Abdul Wahid, or Abdul Wahid, basically has a vision of this beautiful woman in paradise awaiting for him. And he's able to kind of meet her once he dies after killing 9 enemies. So why this is puzzling is because if you look at, this Ainul Mardiya is a term that I've only found within the Malay sources. I haven't yet found any similar examples of that particular name in the Arabic or Persian sources. What this brings to mind, of course, Ain meaning eye, but also the famous verse in the Quran which refers to Huri's Hurin Ain. So, the idea of an eye or also a spring. Mardiya brings to mind one of the levels, many of the tariqas, the Sufi paths that are still current in that area talk of different levels of the self. And the level of Nafs Mardiya is considered to be the 6th on a level of 7, just before the final level of Insan Kamil or perfection. And so it makes one wonder to what extent this is a kind of symbol of a kind of spiritual level, or at least whether the name was inspired by kind of very current systems of describing the spiritual path here. Another example is from the island of Lombok among the people of Sasak. That's in the picture that you can see here. Again, no work as far as I know on this in great detail, but there is actually a lot of evidence, and it's a very popular thing actually among the Sasak people on YouTube today. If you look up the Sasak, you'll find that they're recording performances of this, and this is something known as Bikayat, where they read out hikayats, again, poetic forms of hikayats. And here the aim is not so much military, but all kinds of other things like the treatment of illnesses, starting kind of new endeavors in life and so on. Although I wouldn't be surprised if we go further back into the history. We'll find that Vikayat was used also in the context of jihad, of holy war too. So I suppose I just have a few questions before I jump into one example in more detail of a Hikayat text itself. To what degree are these kind of are the kind of Hindu ideas that, or influences that we'll find these texts, to what degree are they kind of a source of tension? To what degree are the authors themselves comfortable with them? And to what degree they're actually being harmoniously weaved into a very clear kind of spiritual path? And some evidence of use of it, I mentioned earlier Braginsky's work on Sharir Bahr Nisa, but also if you look at the context of Bengal, some of the recent work on the text known as the Madhumalati have shown that some of the epic literature there, actually, if you look at the structure and the way it's written and the symbolism, they clearly represent descriptions of Sufi paths, specifically a tariqah known as a Shatariya, which was also unsurprisingly quite popular in places like Aceh too. Okay, so with the remaining time, we talked a bit about Hikayat Muhammad Hanafiya as an example of a much more thoroughly Islamicized text. So I want to take an example of a text which is not as thoroughly Islamicized. Arguably, it's actually a much more dominantly Hindu text, and see whether or not we can find some understanding of, the degree to which Islam and Hinduism are actually in conflict here, or whether there was a kind of self-conscious adoption of Hindu stories or Hindu teachings in a more Islamicized form. Now, the thing about the Hikayat Pandawa is that there are many versions of the text. So I've, just for simplicity, I've stuck with the well-known Pandawa Lima 1992 edition of Hussein. So bear with me, I haven't managed to translate all the bits here. So I will have to kind of read out and translate as we go along. So here are first few examples just to give you a flavor of the text. Oh, I should mention also what makes this text different from the typical Mahabharata that you might know of is that it doesn't start from the very beginning. It starts from the famous scene where the brothers of Pandava essentially lose their kingdom because of a dice game. So quite early on, they go into exile, and their rivals, the Kauravas, try to kill them by sending a dragon. A dragon swallows them up, and they end up freeing themselves by essentially carving the dragon out from within. And this is, again, I haven't come across this in any other kind of Indian versions of the Mahabharata. So this is very much an example of one of the many examples in the Pandawa Lima of stories that most likely were native to Southeast Asia, perhaps going back to kind of the ancient Javanese reinterpretations of the Mahabharata. So just to give an example of with the intermingling of the two kind of traditions here, we see that after defeating the dragon and carving themselves out from within, Dharmawangsa, who is the eldest brother Yudhishthira in the Indian versions, he undergoes a ritual purification. And the text says, maka Maharaja Dharmawangsa pun bermandi suci membuangkan segala najis daripada tubuhnya. So then King Dharmawangsa then purified himself. He took a ritual bath, and in order to throw away all the najis or the ritual contamination from his body. So those of you who are familiar, of course, with Arabic or the Islamic context will see here that the word najis, of course, brings to mind the idea of purification in Islamic context. So, of course, writing to probably mainly Muslim audience, the author would have used terms that were familiar to them. And even though the context of this kind of experience is thoroughly Hinduized, so a little example further on, we can see when asked by Maharaja Wurgadewa about, so the brothers end up seeking asylum at the court of a king called Wurgadeva. And he begins by asking them what they could do for him, essentially what kind of services they could provide while they're living there. And Dharmawangsa, who has now named himself Rishi Brahmana, so he's actually pretending to be a Brahmin, says, apatah pengetahuan hamba kerana hamba seorang Brahmana, melainkan memuji minta doa. So memuji minta doa. So puji here brings to mind, of course, the idea of Hindu puja, but then alongside the idea of dua as well. So it's as if the author was kind of trying to clarify, perhaps even to two different audiences, one which would have been familiar with the Hindu idea of puja and the other more familiar with the idea of dua. A little bit further on, and this is a character that's, I would argue, is very essential to the story, Bhimanyu, who is the son of Arjuna, the hero, the main hero of the story of Mahabharata. And what's interesting about the story is that he encounters a girl called Siti Sundari, and Siti Sundari does not appear in the Indian versions either. So this is, again, a very much, most likely something going back to the Javanese context. And in order to meet Siti Sundari, and again, there's a beautiful description of Siti Sundari herself and her sitting with all her kind of courtiers and the flowers and the trees and so on. So desiring to meet Siti Sundari, Bhimanyu decides to undergo purification. So he does that by gathering offerings of flowers and incense. And then he turns to it. And then, so it says, maka si Bhimanyu pun memuja menghadap berhalanya. So he then turns to his idol. Berhala is the word for idol. And with this kind of practice of puja, before his eyes manifests a figure called Mahapati. Now, again, I wasn't quite sure Mahapati. I tried looking up Mahapati, and I couldn't find an example from the Indian context. So Mahapati, there was a Mahapati that lived in the Javanese court and was involved, I think, to some degree with rebellion against the Majapahits. But I'm not sure. It could either be a kind of divinized folk hero, or perhaps could be an alternative term for the Hindu god Ganesh. In either case, Bhimanyu is then given a magic item which allows him to become invisible and therefore visit Siti Sundari without being caught out. So these are kind of little examples that show perhaps that the audience were quite familiar with Hindu practices, or at least Hindu ideas, albeit perhaps in a more kind of local flavor of Hindu ideas. There's a recent study that actually showed that many of these stories might have been written to audiences that were kind of, in a way, interested in a fictionalized version of Java. So Javanoisere type of ideas. So I'm not entirely sure. This again goes back to when exactly this text was compiled, and the degree to which we can say anything about the audience that it was addressed to. So going more further into it, one finds that actually there are actually quite deeper theological themes going on in the story. So one example is of course, another well-known figure in the story, which is the Krishna, the incarnation of the god Vishnu, who arguably is quite a central figure in the story, even though a whole load of the Mahabharata, the Bhagavad Gita, is missing from the actual Hikayat. So in the story, Krishna is told, is said he has a dream, and all the other gods basically tell him to go and meditate, Vitapa. This again, this term that goes back to tantric practice, and the idea is to then acquire spiritual power or sakti. Sungguh pun ada Pandawa bertapa, tiada sama dengan Betara Krishna. Jikalau tiada Betara Krishna bertapa, tiada akan Pandawa kekal, karar dan sentosa. So it says that even though the Pandawa themselves practice tapa in order to acquire magical and spiritual power, it was not on the same level as the magical power that can be acquired by Krishna himself. And in fact, this is interesting because it's an important plot element, even though it's a few lines here. It says that even though, if Krishna did not perform the tapa, then essentially the Pandavas would no longer, their kingdom would not be able to, the Pandavas would not attain qarar and sentosa. So again here, the juxtaposition of both an Islamic concept with a Hinduized concept. So qarar, of course, brings to mind the idea of one of the names of the heavens, and according to some of the Islamic theological texts, the lowest level of heaven, Darul Qarar, and Sentosa coming from an Indian context, again referring to kind of the idea of spiritual bliss or attainment. And in fact, we go to the end of the Hikayat Pandawa Lima. The whole point of the story seems to be that in the end, the Pandavas, after they go through all this, they attain entrance into paradise, into heaven, where they live alongside the other gods. So we can very much read this as the kind of point of the story, really, at least is a description of how the brothers Pandava lived their lives and fought for according to their duty in order to achieve this Sentosa at the end. So just to go a little bit deeper into the theological elements of this text, what I found interesting is that one could make the case that there might be more than one theological tradition that the author is being referred to. So either this is pieced together from different elements, and this could well be the case because one of the kind of strongest arguments for the kind of diversity in this text is that it's just pieced together from different elements of either the Javanese text known as the Kakawin or different shadow puppet theaters. So later on, Bhimanyu actually meets the goddess Durga. And in fact, this is kind of where it gets interesting. He does this by taking a ritual bath. And there's a lot of detail actually about what type of equipment or what kind of ingredients we use in different puja ceremonies. So he takes, after he does the ritual bath, he takes the different flowers and then offers them. And then it says that he then cuts off a piece of his foot and burns it as incense. And then he stands in a pose where he stands on one foot, hugging. And this is where I don't think I've found a very compelling explanation for this. Pelot tubo petites. Petites here, from what I've experienced, and this is on an anecdotal level, it's the belief that one can inherit spirits from one's ancestors. Although in some other contexts, it can also be used as related to things like dance rituals where one is actually possessed by different spirits. So he holds himself, he's hold his body while standing on one leg, holding the Pertitis body. And I guess the argument I want to make here is that the Pertitis body here is a kind of tantric body that he has visualized in this activity. Now, the aim of this was to essentially find a way to resolve his problems. He wanted to be with Siti Sundari, but she was basically offered to one of the Kaurava brothers. So he wants to acquire the right powers and energies in order to go and fight his enemies. And so nothing happens, according to the text. It says, after doing this puja, nothing was seen. Then suddenly, while they're asleep, a ghost appears, a very, very tall ghost, holding a sword. And what's interesting here is, again, this is based on anecdotal evidence of my own, just growing up in Malaysia. There is a tradition that says that if you want to summon one of these tall ghosts, we call Hantu Galang, you have to cut a piece of your ankle and offer it. So this brings us deeper into kind of animistic territory, maybe even predating Hindu-Buddhist influence. And so this ghost then, friendly ghost, thankfully, goes and he takes Abhimanyu over, and lo and behold, to the garden of Durga, the well-known kind of fierce goddess of Hindu mythology. And the description here is amazing because, again, this kind of builds up, of course, to battle, but she's described there as sitting on the throne of jewels and gold, which are shining like the sun. But then surrounding her is a garden which is full of skulls and blood. So this kind of weird contrast between beauty and terror. And the next bit, Bhimanyu then goes to Durga and he basically, what he says here is quite interesting. Maka kehendak hati paduka matikan pun patik matilah. Kerana yang menjadikan tuanku yang matikan tuanku. So he says, if you want to kill me now, go ahead, because whoever has created me can also kill me. And this is where I'm still kind of puzzled by this part of the text. And again, it might be worth looking at comparisons with other versions of the Pandawa text. Jikalau laki-laki mati pun sedia betara indra, jikalau perempuan sedia betara seri. So if as I'm not sure what the object or subject of this sentence is, but if perhaps we could read this as the subject. So if I were to be killed by a man, I'm ready, as the god Indra. If as a female, then as the if I was to be killed as a female, then the goddess Sri. And then Durga essentially says to him don't worry, I will actually give you what your heart's desire is. Now, seemingly this is to be together with his beloved. But if we turn to the last bit of the text that I'm going to be talking about, which occurs much further on, the actual scene of the battle itself, what we get is an amazing description, a very, very rich description of Abhimanyu entering the field of battle. As is well known, if you know the Mahabharata text, he enters into the battle formation that the Kauravas have formed and can no longer leave it. And so he ends up being killed. And the description at his death is simply amazing because it brings out, again, it juxtaposes images of beauty alongside terror. So it says, harta kelakian seperti orang yang bermain lakunya kena panah itu tiada bersela lagi kena hujan panah itu pun tiada diperasakannya oleh sang Bimanyu dan lakunya seperti laku laki-laki melihat perempuan yang baik parasnya. So he's being hit by a rain of arrows, even though he doesn't feel it. He seems like he's acting as if he doesn't really feel the pain of these arrows. And his actions are as if a man were witnessing a very beautiful woman. And then the rest of the passage, I guess I'm out of time, so I'm not going to read the Malay text here, but then it describes the different parts of his body. And again, if you look at the picture here, this is a portrayal of Abhimanyu in the wayang kulit, which shows him at the time of his death, kind of being hit by multiple arrows and then blood spurting out. So it compares each part of his body with a different beautiful description of a woman. So it says that when the arrow hits him and his body, it looked like the pengilas. I think this has something to do with kind of ornamentation to the hair of a very beautiful woman. And all his kind of wounds are red, like safflower. Safflower with lime, I think, was a way of creating a kind of cosmetics. It was a sort of makeup. So his neck. Other parts of his body then described in, with allusions to kind of jewelry and beauty. And then towards the end, he says, demikianlah rasanya. So this is how it seemed. This is how it felt. Now, rasa is a very loaded word, of course, within the Hindu context. And I won't go into that today. There's something, a direction I'd like to take this more into. But then it continues. Sang Bimanyu then stands there with the blood splurting out of him, and all the warriors around are basically praising him as if Batara Mitra, I think it's Mitra, not Mirta, as found in Hussein's text, was being married or in the act of sexual consummation with the earth goddess Pertiwi. So again, the juxtaposition of Eros and the kind of battle scene is interesting here. And he finishes off, and this is again, I guess your thoughts on this would be useful, because towards the end, the last words are, he says, I was like a balai, I was like a hall in a forbidden garden. Nobody could sit on it. But now, nobody is forbidden. So where that leads to, I'm not sure. The point is, it's clearly the way that the story is juxtaposed. And again, I haven't had time to go into it, but if you look at it, you compare it with other battle scenes in the story. You could say that there are contrasts as well with other sort of like the warriors who, so for example, Karna, who actually deals the death blow to Arjuna, is described later. Before his death, he's with his wife, and they don't have a good relationship. He tries to seduce her, and she's not interested at all. And then later on, he has a terrible death. Whereas then later on, Salya, another figure, has a wonderful relationship with his wife. This very detailed description of their marital relationship, and then later on has an amazing death. So the idea that somehow, the death in battle is an erotic idea is something quite fascinating. And again, goes back to Ainul Mardia that I mentioned earlier in the context of the Perang Sabil literature. Okay, I suppose I'm close to the end of time, so I think I will skip ahead some of the things I was going to say and just finish with some final reflections. clearly a more detailed survey of this literature is needed. Now, Braginski and others, particularly Braginski, has done an amazing job providing the framework for it. But I do think that this literature needs to be understood beyond this sort of aesthetic and even kind of spiritual, moral dimension, into looking at the magical, performative aspects of text as well. I'm quite intrigued by the presence of Sundari in the Hikayat Pandawa Lima, because it brings to mind the Tripura Sundari of the Shaivaist tradition of Tantra. And as far as I know, no one's looked at that. But I would not be surprised if there is definitely sort of a tantric element in this text. Now, the main question is then whether or not this is a self-conscious transmission, or whether by the time this text was recorded, it was simply kind of an unconscious trope that had basically entered into classical Malay Islamic literature. So I guess in the long run, we could think about the general historical context of the Malay world, where Siddhantas of Tantric Shaivism and Buddhism were in the long run replaced by Muslim storytellers, the Penglipu Lara, and poets, the Pujanga. And perhaps complex spiritual and philosophical systems such as Tantra were given a local flavoring, often geared to local interest in acquiring practical, magical power. Now, meanwhile, while the ulama did resist this, there was also an attempt to provide alternatives, and perhaps this is how we can understand Hikayat Muhammad Hanafiya, which we talked about earlier. Somehow, whether consciously or unconsciously, certain tropes were allowed to continue into the 19th century. So, despite the efforts of the ulama, perhaps both due to the wonderful aesthetic qualities of these texts, as well as ongoing interest in spiritual practices and magic benefits of those spiritual practices, we still have these texts today. I suppose I'll leave at it with the Ain al-Mardiya, which is, again, I mentioned, interestingly, a recent Malaysian religious pop music group wrote a song called Ain al-Mardiya, where she's described sitting on the throne, awaiting the martyr. And it made me wonder to what extent this was, perhaps whoever the original Siti Mardiya is, whether it was Tripura Sundari of the Tantric tradition, or perhaps some other Hindu goddess, to what extent this was a self-conscious adaptation? At what point did this go and become a general trope? And one way or the other, we see within these texts an interesting combination of Muslim chivalry, Javan Mardi, Hindu Jivan Mukti, spiritual attainment, and arguably pre-Islamic, pre-Hindu interest in magical spiritual practices, Kesaktian. Thank you.